The metal still gleamed on his chest when the whispers began. It was the kind of irony America knew too well. One day a hero, the next a problem. Harold Davis had fought in deserts and mountains half a world away, but nothing had prepared him for the battlefield that was about to unfold on his own front lawn. The day his son Marcus introduced his boyfriend at the neighborhood barbecue, Harold felt the air shift like a storm cloud rolling in. Plates clattered, laughter stilled, and smiles thinned into tight-lipped silence. These were the same neighbors who had once saluted him at parades, who baked pies when he returned from duty, who lined their fences with flags when he was awarded the Bronze Star. But now their eyes darted, their hands fidgeted, and suddenly, Harold was no longer the man who defended their freedom, was the father of that boy. Marcus's hand didn't tremble when he reached for Chris's. He was 17, but his courage startled Harold, echoing the same reckless bravery Harold had once carried into war. Chris, pale-skinned with sandy hair, shifted uneasily under the stairs, but he held on. Harold knew the cost of letting go in moments like this. He felt every gaze drilling into his back, and in that silence, he heard the verdict. Betrayal. Not his, but theirs. "Food's ready," someone muttered, and the barbecue stumbled forward with forced cheer, but nothing was the same. Conversations hushed when Marcus laughed. Plates were passed quickly, hands avoiding brushes. The world Harold had built here, the safety, the belonging, the hard-earned respect, was crumbling in real time, and there was no enemy he could shoot at to stop it. When the last guest left, the yard still smelled of charcoal and distrust. Marcus excused himself upstairs, Chris trailing close, leaving Harold alone with the echo of old war songs sung in his head. He stared at the flag on his porch, a fabric that had followed him through foxholes and funerals. He had saluted it in dust and blood, believing it meant something unbreakable. Tonight it looked smaller, almost fragile, like it too might give way under the weight of judgment. The first act of resistance came subtle. Harold noticed it when the Johnsons, who lived 2 doors down, didn't wave the next morning. Mrs. Green skipped her usual chat over the hedges. Then came the whispers Marcus heard at school, the cruel graffiti scrawled on Chris's locker. Harold's wife, Lillian, urged patience. "They'll come around," she whispered, though even she avoided eye contact when the church pews suddenly had more space around them. But patience was not a soldier's weapon. Harold had been trained to act, to defend, to hold ground. He remembered nights in the desert when silence meant death, when waiting meant losing men. And this was his son. Marcus's shoulders slumped lower each day, and Chris's smile faltered. Harold saw the weight pressing down on them, the same weight he once carried in combat, except now it was heavier because it was home doing the crushing. One evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, hands folded tight. "Maybe it would be easier if I just didn't say anything, if I kept it private. I don't want you to lose friends, Dad." His voice cracked. "I don't want you to lose respect." Harold's jaw clenched. He reached across, placing his calloused hand over Marcus's. "Son, I didn't fight half a world away so you could come home and fight alone. Respect that disappears the moment you tell the truth ain't worth having." His voice was steady, but his chest burned. Chris nodded softly, eyes wet. "People hate what they don't understand," he whispered. Harold looked at him and saw not just his son's boyfriend, but another kid's cared, searching for a place to stand. And Harold knew, if he backed down now, he'd be telling both boys that love was negotiable, that dignity had conditions. That wasn't the America he bled for. The retaliation escalated. Eggs smashed against their door one night, a slur painted in red on their fence. At the grocery store, people moved their carts aside like Harold carried disease. A woman who once kissed his cheek at Sunday service now whispered shame as she passed. Yet Harold didn't flinch. He walked Marcus to school, hand on his boy's shoulder like a guard on duty. He fixed the fence himself, sanding the wood until the hateful paint disappeared. He attended the PTA meeting where silence greeted him like barbed wire, and when Marcus read a poem about love that defied fear, Harold clapped the loudest, his palms stinging like gunfire. Inside, though, the battles carved deeper. Lillian cried quietly in their room, torn between loyalty to family and the longing for community that had once embraced them. Marcus grew quieter, retreating into books and music. Harold, alone on the porch at night, felt the war returning, not the bombs and bullets, but the endless fight to believe freedom wasn't a lie. But he refused to surrender, because surrender, he knew, was how hate won. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Harold had walked into the church that had once been his refuge, the place where he had buried friends, baptized his children, and sung hymns with tears in his eyes. Today, the pews seemed colder, the organ quieter, and the faces around him carved from stone. The pastor's sermon shifted, subtle at first. Words about moral decay and the sanctity of family rang heavy in the air. Harold felt Marcus tense beside him. He didn't need to look. He knew his son's jaw was tight, his eyes lowered. Chris sat at the far edge of the pew, his hands twisting nervously. When the benediction ended, no one reached out for Harold's handshake. Not one palm met his. The congregation filed past him like he was invisible. Lillian's lips pressed tight, but she walked out quietly. Marcus lingered, his breath shallow. Finally, he whispered, "Dad, why are we even here?" The question stabbed sharper than shrapnel. Harold had always believed faith was an anchor, but what good was an anchor if it dragged you under? He looked around the church at the polished wood and stained glass, and all he saw was betrayal. "Maybe we're not," he answered softly, and with that, he led his family out into the bright sun. That afternoon, the phone rang. It was a reporter from the local paper. Word had spread about the barbecue, about the church, about the neighborhood turning. They wanted his side. "Mr. Davis," the voice said, "as a decorated veteran and community figure, do you have a comment about the backlash against your son?" Harold hesitated. He had never chased attention. His service was quiet, his medals earned but not flaunted. Yet he thought of Marcus's hunched shoulders, of Chris's timid smile, of the neighbors teaching their kids to look away. Maybe silence was another form of surrender. "Yes," Harold said finally, his voice firm. "You can tell them this. I served this country to protect the freedoms of all its people. My son is one of those people. He has the right to live openly, to love openly, and anyone who forgets that forgets what America stands for. I will not stand down. Not this time." The article came out 2 days later. His words printed in bold, his picture beneath a headline that read, "Veteran defends gay son against community backlash." The fallout was swift. Some letters of support arrived in the mail, from strangers who called him brave, who thanked him for standing up. But closer to home, the anger grew. His mailbox was smashed, tires slashed. At night, phone calls came with silence or whispered threats before hanging up. Lillian wept quietly, begging Harold to reconsider speaking out. "Maybe if we just stay quiet, it'll pass," she pleaded. Harold shook his head. "Lillian, they don't want us quiet. They want us broken. And I won't let them break him." He glanced at Marcus, who was listening from the hallway. Their eyes met, and Harold hoped his son understood. This wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity. Marcus did understand more than Harold realized. That week, he joined the school's LGBTQ+ support group, though it meant walking into a room most students mocked. Chris went with him, and together they started planning a small awareness event. Posters about acceptance, a poetry reading in the auditorium. Harold saw the fire returning to his son's eyes, and for a moment, he believed maybe this was the path forward. But hate rarely retreats without a fight. The night of the event, as Harold drove Marcus and Chris to school, they found the auditorium doors defaced. Spray-painted in black were the words, "Sin doesn't belong here." Marcus froze. Chris's face paled. Harold stared at the wall of cruelty, his blood pounding in his ears. He stepped forward, reached for a rag in his truck, and began scrubbing. His fingers tore, paint smearing across his hands, but he didn't stop until the words faded. Students gathered, whispering, some laughing. Teachers tried to usher them inside, but the damage had already been done. Marcus stood stiff, his fists clenched. "You don't have to do this," Chris whispered. Yes, I do, Marcus said and walked inside. The event went on, though attendance was sparse. Marcus read his poem anyway. His voice trembled at first, but then it rose, strong, unwavering. They told me to hide, but the truth burns brighter than shame, and I will not trade love for their silence. The auditorium echoed with his words. Harold stood in the back, eyes stinging, his chest swelling with both pride and pain. Afterward, Marcus walked up to him. "Did I sound stupid?" he asked, his voice small again. Harold shook his head. "You sounded like a soldier," he said, "but battles carry consequences." The next day, Marcus came home with a split lip. He didn't explain much, just muttered about a group of boys at school. Harold's rage nearly boiled over. He wanted names, addresses, retaliation. But Marcus begged him not to. "They'll just make it worse, Dad. Please." Harold sat in silence, his fists tight, his breath heavy. For the first time, he felt powerless. Out there, on foreign soil, he had a weapon, a unit, a mission. Here, he had laws that looked away, a town that excused cruelty, and a son who was learning the cost of honesty. That night, Harold sat on the porch, staring at the stars. He thought of the men he'd lost in war, of the promises he'd made to them about freedom, about fighting for something better. He whispered their names into the dark, as if asking permission. And then he knew. The fight wasn't just about Marcus or Chris or even himself. It was about whether America could be the place it claimed to be. So Harold went back to the reporter. He told him more about the eggs, the slurs, the church silence, the split lip his son now carried. The reporter listened, recorded, and published. This time the story spread further, picked up by regional outlets, then national. The phone rang off the hook. Some calls were venom, but others were voices of support. Veterans from other towns, parents of gay children, strangers who sent letters filled with gratitude and solidarity. Harold pinned some to the fridge for Marcus to see. "Look at this," Harold said one morning, holding a letter from a retired Marine. "He says his daughter came out last year. Says he's proud of her, and proud of us." Marcus's lips curled into the first real smile Harold had seen in weeks. But for every supporter, there was an enemy closer to home. The Davis family became the center of a storm. Protesters gathered outside their house with signs about family values. Lillian begged Harold to think of their safety. "This isn't a war zone," she said through tears. "Yes, it is," Harold answered quietly. "It just doesn't look like one." And so the battle lines sharpened. The crowd outside their house grew larger with each passing weekend. At first, it was a handful of people holding crude signs. Then came dozens, standing on the curb with bullhorns, chanting verses and slogans that struck like knives through the evening air. "Protect our children. Keep sin out of our streets." Their voices carried into Marcus's room, where he tried to study but couldn't escape the words hurled against his existence. Chris had started avoiding the house, afraid of being seen walking up the path. Marcus noticed, and his laughter dimmed. One night, he whispered to Harold, "Maybe Chris shouldn't come around anymore. I don't want him to get hurt because of me." Harold placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Son, love doesn't survive behind locked doors. If he wants to be here, he'll be here. And I'll stand at the door if I have to." But Harold knew the strain was wearing them all thin. Lillian flinched whenever the phone rang, certain it would be another threat. She spent her nights staring at the family photo wall, as if trying to remember the version of life that existed before the town turned on them. Harold caught her crying once, her hand pressed to the picture of Marcus as a baby, and he wanted to tell her it would all be okay. But soldiers know better than to promise what they can't guarantee. Then came the night of fire. Harold woke to the crackle of wood, the acrid stench of smoke slicing through the house. He bolted upright, instincts from combat roaring awake. Out the window, orange light flickered against the darkness. The porch was ablaze, flames licking at the railing. "Get Marcus!" Harold barked, rushing toward the door. Lillian screamed his name, but he didn't stop. He tore through the front, grabbed the garden hose, and doused the fire with a fury that left his arms shaking. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching but not helping, their faces ghostly in the glow. By the time the fire department arrived, Harold had already beaten the flames back, his chest heaving, his clothes soaked. The police came, too, but their questions felt more like suspicions than concern. Could it have been an accident? One officer asked, his tone flat. An accident? Harold snapped. He jabbed a finger toward the charred porch. You think a fire starts itself in a perfect circle with gasoline poured neat as a border? Don't insult me. The officer looked away, scribbling in his notepad. No arrests were made. That night, Marcus sat on the couch, his knees drawn to his chest. Chris had rushed over after hearing the news, his pale face stricken with guilt. This is my fault, he whispered. No, Harold said firmly, his voice steel. This is Hate's fault. Don't you dare carry it. But he knew the attack had changed something. This wasn't whispers anymore. This wasn't just slurs or sideways glances. This was war, and Harold was not about to lose. The next morning, he stood on the blackened porch with a hammer in one hand and nails in the other. He rebuilt the railing plank by plank, his movements steady, deliberate. Neighbors watched, some whispering, some sneering, but he ignored them. By noon, the porch stood whole again, defiant in the sunlight. Marcus helped him paint, strokes bold and unflinching. Together they made the wood gleam brighter than before, as if daring anyone to try again. News of the fire spread fast. The local paper ran a story, then a television crew arrived. Cameras rolled as Harold stood on his porch, his medals glinting in the sun. I fought for this country, he told them, voice unwavering. And I'll fight for my family. Hate tried to burn us down, but we're still standing. And we will keep standing. The clip went viral. Messages of support poured in from across the nation. Veterans reached out, civil rights groups called, and for the first time Harold felt the tide shifting. But with support came more venom. Anonymous letters stuffed into the mailbox. Threats scrawled on scraps of paper. The crowd outside grew louder, angrier. Still, Harold stood on his porch every evening, arms crossed, eyes locked on them. He didn't shout back. He didn't move. He simply stood, a wall of flesh and spirit. Marcus sometimes joined him, and together they faced the storm. But the weight of the battle was taking its toll. At school, Marcus grew quieter. Teachers called home, concerned about his slipping grades. Chris tried to keep his spirits up, but Marcus pulled away, retreating into silence. One night, Harold found him sitting alone in the garage, staring at his hands. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Marcus whispered. Everywhere I go, it feels like people are waiting to hurt me. Maybe it would be easier if I just stopped being me. Harold's chest tightened like a vice. He knelt, gripping his son's shoulders. Don't you ever say that. Don't you let them erase you. You hear me? They can take respect, they can take comfort, they can take friends, but they can't take you. The only way they win is if you stop being you. Tears brimmed in Marcus's eyes. But why does it have to be so hard? Because the world's slow to catch up, Harold said softly. But every time someone like you stands tall, it gets closer. And one day, son, it won't be this hard. One day, kids like you won't have to fight this fight. But for that day to come, you can't quit now. They sat together in the garage until the crickets stilled the night. Harold held his boy close, feeling the tremor in his body, and vowed silently that he would carry the weight as long as Marcus needed. Days later, the school announced it was canceling the LGBTQ+ groups meetings for safety reasons. Marcus came home, eyes blazing with fury. They're punishing us for existing, he spat. That's what power does when it's scared, Harold replied. He placed a hand on his son's back. So what do we do? Marcus hesitated. We fight back. Harold smiled faintly. Now you're talking. And fight back they did. Harold reached out to the organizations that had sent him letters. Civil rights groups offered legal support. Veterans networks amplified his story. Soon, rallies formed not against them, but for them. People marched through town carrying signs of love and acceptance. Rainbow flags waved beside American flags, colors blending under the sun. The first rally drew counter-protesters, and the tension was thick as a battlefield. Harold stood at the front, Marcus and Chris by his side. He spoke into the microphone, his voice carrying across the crowd. I bled for this country. I buried friends for this country. And I will not watch it betray the very freedom they died for. My son is not a threat. Love is not a threat. Hate is the threat. Fear is the threat. And we will not bow to it. Cheers erupted. Marcus squeezed his father's hand, his eyes shining with pride. Chris clung to Marcus's other hand, his face a mixture of fear and awe. The counter-protesters shouted back, their signs raised high, but the sound of applause drowned them out. For the first time, Harold felt the tide turn in real time. Not a victory, not yet, but a shift. That night, when they returned home, Lillian hugged Harold longer than she had in months. You're changing things, she whispered. No, Harold said, shaking his head. He's changing things. He nodded toward Marcus, who was asleep on the couch, Chris's head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in weeks, Harold allowed himself to believe they might win this fight not just for survival, but for belonging. But even victories carry shadows. The threats didn't stop. The stares didn't fade. And Harold knew the war was far from over. Yet now they weren't fighting alone. The world was watching. Allies were rising. And Marcus, his boy, was still standing. The morning of the town hall meeting felt heavier than any battlefield Harold had ever stepped into. The city council had announced an open forum after weeks of unrest. The decision of whether to support or ban LGBTQ+ initiatives in schools would be discussed publicly, and every side was preparing for war with words. For Harold, this was the moment. Not just for Marcus, not just for Chris, but for every kid who had ever felt cornered into silence. Marcus was pale as they dressed that morning, buttoning his shirt with trembling fingers. Chris came to meet them, offering a small smile of solidarity, though his eyes betrayed fear. Lillian hovered, torn between wanting to protect them and fearing the wounds that might come. Harold put on his military jacket, the one with medals glinting on the chest. Not as decoration, but as armor. When they arrived, the parking lot was split like two halves of a battlefield. On one side, rainbow flags, posters of support, chants of love and equality. On the other, signs damning sin, chants of protect our town. Faces twisted with anger. Police officers stood between them, but Harold knew barriers could only do so much when fear was this raw. Inside, the town hall overflowed with bodies. The air was thick with tension, every cough echoing like a gunshot. Harold led his family to the front row, ignoring the glares that followed. Marcus squeezed Chris's hand, whispering something only he could hear, but Harold saw the flicker of courage return to his son's eyes. One by one, speakers took the podium. Parents condemning, teachers pleading, pastors preaching, students sharing stories of pain. The room swayed between cheers and boos, every voice another blow in the war for dignity. When Harold's name was called, silence swept the room. He rose slowly, his boots heavy against the tile, and walked to the microphone. The medals on his chest caught the light, but his eyes carried the true weight. My name is Harold Davis, he began, his voice steady. I served this country for 24 years. I fought in wars you've only read about in newspapers. I've buried men who never made it home, and I carry their names with me every single day. The room was silent, held captive by his gravity. I was awarded medals for bravery, for protecting freedom. But what is freedom worth if it vanishes the moment my son chooses honesty? You clapped when I wore this uniform. You saluted when I marched in parades. But when my boy told you who he is, you turned your backs. Ask yourselves, was your respect for me real, or was it conditional? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harold's voice deepened, rich with fire. My son is not broken. My son is not shame. He is love. And if you believe love is something to fear, then the problem isn't him, it's you. This town preaches family values. But tell me, What value is greater than standing by your child? What value is greater than protecting the freedom to be who you are? He paused, scanning faces, some hardened, some softened with shame. He continued, I didn't fight so my son could hide. I didn't fight so my family could live in fear of our neighbors. I fought so he could walk in the light, unafraid. And I'll keep fighting not with weapons, but with truth. Because truth, no matter how hard you try to bury it, will always rise. Applause erupted from one half of the room, cheers shaking the walls. The other half shouted back boos and jeers. The sound clashed, a storm of division. But Harold stood tall at the center, unshaken. Marcus rose from his seat, walked to the podium, and placed a trembling hand on the microphone. I'm Marcus, he said, his voice small at first. And I'm gay. The word hung in the air like a spark. I didn't choose it. I didn't ask for it. But I'm not sorry for it. And I shouldn't have to be. His eyes swept the crowd, finding Chris in the front row. You don't have to love me. You don't even have to like me. But you don't get to erase me. I deserve to exist just like you. And if you think my existence threatens you, then maybe you need to look at why your world is so fragile. The room roared again, voices colliding, but Marcus didn't flinch. He stepped back, standing beside his father, their shoulders touching. For a moment, Harold saw himself reflected in his boy, not the soldier he had been, but the soldier his son was becoming. The meeting ended without resolution. The council postponed their decision, claiming they needed time to deliberate. Outside, tensions boiled over. Protesters screamed, counter-protesters chanted. Police formed barriers, but shouting turned into shoving. Harold shielded Marcus and Chris, pushing them toward the car. As they pulled away, Marcus stared out the window, tears streaking his face. We didn't change anything, he whispered. Yes, we did, Harold said firmly. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but every word you spoke, every truth you claimed, planted something. Change doesn't happen in one battle. It happens in many. And today, son, you fought yours. Days turned to weeks. The porch fire was repaired. The hateful calls lessened. Slowly, support began to outweigh hate. Strangers in town stopped Harold on the street, some to thank him, some to whisper apologies for their silence. The Johnsons, who hadn't waved in months, left a pie on their porch with a note. We were wrong. We're sorry. At school, the LGBTQ+ group was reinstated. Marcus's poem was published in the local paper, sparking letters from kids across the state. Chris's parents, once hesitant, invited Marcus to dinner. Step by step, the cracks of prejudice began to widen, letting light seep through. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Harold sat on the rebuilt porch. Marcus joined him, Chris trailing behind. The golden light painted their faces, warm and gentle. Dad, Marcus said, his voice quiet, do you ever regret it? Speaking out? Fighting? Harold looked at his son, then at the medals on his chest. He shook his head. The only thing I'd regret is silence. And you, he rested a hand on Marcus's back. You gave me more reason to fight than I've ever had. Marcus smiled, a real one this time, and leaned into his father's shoulder. Chris slipped his hand into Marcus's, unafraid, as if the world beyond the porch no longer held the same power to wound. For the first time in months, Harold felt peace settle into his bones. Not because the war was over, it wasn't, but because he knew they weren't fighting alone anymore, and because he had seen his son step into the fire and come out still burning bright. The porch light flicked on, chasing back the dark. Lillian joined them, slipping her arm through Harold's. The family sat together, silent, watching the horizon glow. Maybe tomorrow would bring another battle. Maybe the world would stumble again. But tonight there was hope. Tonight there was love. And for Harold Davis, soldier, father, fighter, that was victory enough. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.